Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our in-person audience as well as to our online audience for a discussion of the potential and opportunity for a U.S. UK Free Trade Agreement. Those of you that are trade wonks, like those of us at CSIS, know this is free trade agreements have been an issue of some controversy. With the Biden administration has not wanted to pursue trade agreements that have market access provisions or which need to be submitted to Congress. I think that people have different views about that, but clearly I think if you get into the thought about whether we should do them, once you get past that, the most obvious one to consider doing is one with the UK. A longtime ally. I think a lot of people would say this is low-hanging fruit. And we set out to study that a little bit, and I think Meredith Broadbent in a few minutes is going to talk about our findings. But I think that one of the questions will be whether it really is low-hanging fruit or not. It's certainly a desirable target, but there are a number of issues that always come out in trade agreements, because trade agreements, after all, whether they have market access provisions or not, are about what's good for us and what's good for the other party, whoever it is. And certainly with the UK, there are a number of issues that will prove difficult to resolve, the main one probably being agriculture, which I'm sure we'll be talking about today with both our lead-off speaker and our panel to follow. That's an ideal, for those of you that know me, this is an ideal opportunity for me to make a chicken joke, which I make frequently in my columns. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave that to Dave Salmonsen or Congressman Smith to make a chicken joke. But there are issues, and we're going to go through the issues and have, I hope, a series of good discussions. Our pattern here is going to be that when I get done talking, our keynoter, Congressman Smith, is going to come up and make some remarks, and then he and Meredith Broadbent are going to have a conversation, followed by questions from the live audience and online questions. And then he has to leave, so at 2 o'clock we'll add a couple chairs to the podium, and then we'll have a panel discussion with Meredith and the people that I'm about to introduce. And so we'll drill down into some of the specifics with the panel, as well as hear what Mr. Smith has to say about the whole thing. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Congressman Adrian Smith, who is a sixth-generation Nebraskan, which is an impressive accomplishment, and also represents, in land terms, most of the state. If you look at a map of districts, there's a little one around Omaha, there's a slightly bigger one, and then all the rest of the state is his. He was elected first in 2006, so he is a well-established veteran, and he currently serves as chairman of the Trade Subcommittee of the House Committee on Ways and Means, where he, among other things, actively promotes market access, not just for Nebraska products, but for all of America's products, particularly agriculture products, all over the world. He also has been active on tax issues as a member of the Subcommittee on Health and the Subcommittee on Work and Welfare. So it's a real pleasure to have him with us. Now, the panel is going to be moderated by Meredith Broadbent, who I think many of you know, who is a non-resident fellow here at CSIS, also former many things, former member and chair of the International Trade Commission, former assistant U.S. trade representative, former Ways and Means staffer, going back quite some time. And so Meredith, who is also the author of our paper, is going to tell you about our findings and then moderate the panel. And the panelists are, briefly, Shanker Singham, who has a long career of basically straddling both sides of the Atlantic, one leg here and one leg in the UK. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Competere, an academic fellow to the IEA. In the UK, he sits on the Trade and Agriculture Commission and the Wilton Park Advisory Council. In the U.S., he's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bretton Woods Committee. He was an advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative on SPS and TBT issues. Trade wonks will know what that means. And he was advisor to the UK Trade Secretary on international trade issues. He is the author of over 100 articles and book chapters, as well as a leading textbook on the interface between trade, competition, and regulatory issues. Next, we have Dave Salmonsen, who is currently Senior Director of Government Relations with the American Farm Bureau Federation here in Washington, As a member of the International Agriculture Policy Team, his responsibilities include trade negotiations, along with being the principal Washington contact for several northeastern state farm bureaus. Before he joined the Farm Bureau, he was assistant to the commissioner of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, and he grew up on a farm in New York, which is dear to my heart because I work for the Senator from Pennsylvania, and nobody realizes that New York and Pennsylvania are big agriculture states. You know, where Mr. Smith is from gets all the ink, but in fact, you know, there's a lot of stuff being grown in both New York and Pennsylvania, and I'm delighted to have David here, who's an old friend. Finally, we have Jeff Weiss, who has spent more than 15 years in senior legal, policy, diplomatic negotiations, and political roles in the government through 3 administrations, including the White House, USTR, and the Office of the Secretary of Commerce. Currently, he co-chairs Steptoe's trade policy practice and leads their supply chain team practice. At USTR, he was Senior Director for Technical Barriers to Trade, Assistant General Counsel, and Assistant Legal Advisor at our mission to the WTO in Geneva, and has a long history of participation in some of our main trade negotiations during his tenure there. They will be on afterwards, but right now I give you Adrian Smith.
Well, good afternoon. I'm honored to be here. Appreciate the invitation. We've got many important things we need to do, and I certainly appreciate this opportunity to discuss what I think is so important with the U.S. UK trade relationship. Thank you, Meredith, for the time and effort that you put into this entire issue, and I couldn't agree more. Now is the time. I was actively engaged in the process for USMCA, and I understand trade agreements, certainly they are tough, but we know they're worthwhile, and when done properly, we can achieve our shared goals, which are new markets for American producers and consumers, strong labor and environmental standards because the U.S. is writing the rules of the road, and strong enforcement mechanisms so we can hold our trade partners accountable to their commitments. Trade works. It's good for America and it's good for the world when we lean in on this issue. That's why I've been incredibly disappointed in the administration's framework-first approach. There's just no way to ensure the same level of accountability and access through a framework. I'm not rooting for these talks. I'm not rooting for these talks like IPEF and APEP to fail, but I don't see how any end product actually guarantees the same kind of success we get with a true trade agreement. The UK is a perfect example of leaving opportunities on the table. The United Kingdom is one of our strongest, closest allies. The Trump administration already started the work of bringing the UK to the table, and the appetite to reach a strong, comprehensive trade agreement that is rooted in science is there. As you know, the UK is a like-minded partner with similar commercial interests and values in the global economy. Reinforcing economic relationships with key allies will be key in combating China's influence. China's ongoing and escalation of threatening behavior around the world is a serious threat, including right here in our country. Every time the U.S. leans in on trade and collaborates with like-minded partners around the world, China's influence withers. Unfortunately, it seems where the Biden administration has missed that message, the UK has not. They're not sitting on the sidelines waiting for us to come to the table, and the window of opportunity to pursue a U.S. UK trade agreement, I believe, is shrinking. We lose opportunity to establish standards as we'd like them with each new binding agreement the UK signs. The U.S. is the most sought-after market, and we should leverage this strategic advantage. The longer we ignore it, the higher the economic cost. As we wait, China's value increases with its aggressive economic and geopolitical strategy. Meredith, again, said it well. The time is now. Thank you again for having me, and I certainly look forward to our discussion.
So do you feel like you're in the eye of the storm?
In many ways, yes, but I also see this as an opportunity because it gives us the chance to lead. And as I mentioned before, when we can lead and really lean in, it's how we improve environmental standards, labor standards, and actually opening up markets. And that market access is key. If we're not gaining market access, I fear we are losing it, and therefore we need to lean in.
Yep. What do you see ahead for trade legislation in the House, and how will your priorities be different from Chairman Neal and Speaker Pelosi?
Well, I think that, number one, trade is a much more bipartisan issue than a lot of folks realize. USMCA, it got done in a very bipartisan fashion. I even like to say that there were more Democrats who voted for that, a Trump priority, than Republicans. Of course, that had somewhat to do with the balance of the House. But it needed to be done. It needed to be updated. And so, yes, there was reluctance. And in fact, there was even a little a nervousness among agriculture because NAFTA had served so much of agriculture quite well. So the mantra was do no harm. But for example, there were no references to biotechnology in NAFTA. Well, now there are with USMCA. Of course, we need to enforce that now too, which is key. But I think it all goes back to the fact we need to lead on this, and we can achieve that by pushing. So our agenda, now I can't, I'm not the speaker, I'm not the full committee chair either, but I think there is an eagerness for us to say, and to work toward what we want to sell and need to sell around the world, because that's what brings more prosperity here to manufacturing and agriculture, and as important as that is.
The administration, as you mentioned, has proposed a number of trade light dialogues, IPEF and APEP and the U.S. EU Trade and Technology Council. And as you mentioned, we think, and we agree with you, that it's important to get back to full trade negotiations with market access commitments. If this is all important, would the UK not be the ideal candidate, as there would be bipartisan support for a deal with sort of no race to the bottom on labor and environment? As you're weighing the different countries that are interested, how do you assess them?
No, I think it's clear that so many countries want more access to our markets. Now let's be realistic. Over time, we've basically given other countries more access to our markets than they have given us to theirs. So we want to level that playing field, and the most effective and productive means of doing that, I believe, are trade agreements. Now, when you look at U.S. UK relations, we have very similar values. This is something that I'm very hopeful we can get done. As a representative of agriculture, that is important to have as well. But I think these can be very productive discussions that can result in bringing our countries even as close as we already are, but even strengthening, because let's face it, when you look at the geopolitical issues around the world, it's important that we even strengthen the good, strong relationships so that we may already have for the future.
We think that the fact that the UK has disengaged somewhat from the EU regulatory system may create opportunities for US trade negotiators to make headway on improving UK regulatory practices that govern US exports to the UK. As you know, the US favors a more pro-competitive science-based system that is not wedded to the EU precautionary principle. Do you think this will be important for Congress? What do you think Congress will see as important in the US UK trade agreement?
Well, I think the UK pulling away basically from the EU makes it easier for us to have establish a trade agreement and get this done than expecting all of the EU to want to engage the same way. So that's why I'm encouraged, and also we can't shy away from working through the topics that we know we need to work through. As has been mentioned, trade agreements aren't easy, but we can't just sit back and let the status quo run things, because we'll be losing ground.
Ambassador Tai speaks about a worker-centered trade policy. Sometimes I get the feeling that she doesn't think that using U.S. Chair's resources to expand U.S. exports in global markets is all that worker-centric. I mean, I feel some ambivalence there. Am I being fair about that?
Well, I appreciate Ambassador Tai's desire to strengthen workers. I work to do that as well. I think when we look at how most productive to achieve that, it's really hard to say that trade agreements have not been a great tool around the world for actually elevating environmental standards, elevating labor standards as well. Had we not engaged on trade over the last few decades, I really believe that labor standards and environmental standards in other countries would be worse than what they are right now.
Right. So I assume you think those are some of the areas of cooperation on trade with President Biden. Yeah, I know he didn't mention anything on trade in the State of the Union that I can recall, except for the Buy America mandates, excuse me. Are you sensing that there are any key market access barriers that Ambassador Tai is willing to work on and push hard on?
Well, I think in the new majority, we need to push. Make no mistake, the president talks about Buy American. A lot of Republicans talk about Buy American too. I think, obviously we want to support domestic jobs whenever we can. Kevin Brady, former chairman of the full committee, he always makes a great point of when we want to buy American, keep in mind we also want to sell American. This is key, and especially when you see the productivity in our agriculture sector domestically, but think about the importance and the opportunity of helping feed the world, just agriculture alone. You take, to other sectors of our economy, manufacturing. I mean, my own district, yes, we're known for agriculture, but we have significant manufacturing as well. Or, processing of agriculture products, that's manufacturing, adding value here, and to maintain and grow opportunities to export. I can't say enough how important that is. And certainly, again, I know where the president's coming from on the Buy American priority, but like I said earlier, and Kevin Brady says, let's remember we want to sell American.
Yeah. One exception to the divide between Democrats and Republicans is the bipartisan consensus to get more hawkish with China. How do you think Congress will respond to China's counterproductive behavior? Are you considering legislation that may set up some incentives as well as sticks to help diffuse the confrontation?
Well, I think as we see China's strategy employed, various parts of the world, from Africa to other continents as well, they are aggressive. That doesn't mean we should just sit back and do nothing and just talk about it. Engaging on trade, especially with how China likes to sell their products, engaging on trade, I think, is the most appropriate and effective means of holding China accountable. Certainly then we need to enforce trade agreements too, but I think making sure that China knows that we are paying attention and that when they say they're going to buy some of our products, we hold them to that and those commitments and constantly reminding them of that as well. But trade agreements is really, with whatever country it might be at a given point in time, is evidence that we are serious, that we are aggressive, and that we mean business,
right,
and that ultimately we will bring more prosperity to our own economy.
Right. We know that many U.S.-based companies are scaling down operations in China and often moving to neighboring countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. The U.S. is not part of CPTPP or RCEP, the Chinese-dominated agreement, which, while overall a pretty weak deal, does contain significant reductions in tariffs and expansions of tariff rate quotas for the members of RCEP and not us. Is there a danger that the U.S. will be left on the outside looking in as these markets of middle-class consumers grow dramatically in the next 10 years?
Short answer, yes. I couldn't put it more directly, watching other countries engage, even among themselves, aside from China, that is something we should be concerned about. And like I said before, if we're not gaining market access, we're probably losing it. And the competition is alive and well, whether we participate or not, which means our competitors, even friendly competitors, they're likely gaining market share as we would be losing it. And I hope we can work together to avoid that.
Well, the Ways and Means Committee is also ground zero for a lot of tax issues, and the European Union has achieved unanimity on implementing the OECD Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 tax agreements. And OECD countries continue to release implementation guidelines, including guidance for the untaxed profit rule, which allows countries to levy additional taxes on companies doing business in their jurisdiction, which are paying below the 15% rate in other jurisdictions. You and other House Republicans have made clear that you have no interest in implementing this agreement, and at some degree it just doesn't work. Should we expect calls for trade remedies? How do you expect USTR to handle the confrontation that we've got coming up with these countries?
Yeah, it would be interesting to know what kind of dialogue in-house, for lack of a better term, between USTR and Treasury. You know, Secretary Yellen, she led the way on supposedly a negotiation, but yeah. I worry that she gave too much away. We're already seeing other countries who said they agreed, they're finding workarounds. And competition, when applied evenly, can do so much. Helps consumers, helps producers, grows an economy, grows opportunity. So to remove competition, in this case taxation, and a competitive tax code, to remove that, I just think is a step in the wrong direction, and especially as it relates to what some would want to do, of thinking that if we just raise taxes, everything else will fall into place. And when you see what we did with tax reform of 2017, TCJA, that internationally, now in the years leading up to TCJA, there was basically common agreement that we were least competitive internationally in different ways with our, especially our corporate tax code. So you even saw, President Obama supporting a more competitive corporate tax code, and we had some good discussions, I think, at the time. When you see what we ultimately did in 2017, it was highly productive, and it really teed up, I think. Was it perfect? No, and that's why we need to always remain engaged on that and finding new ways to have tax policy level the playing field and also create more competition. But to just cede all of this agreement and authority basically to other countries, I think is a step in the wrong direction.
Okay. I know living standards for farmers in Nebraska are linked to export sales of soybeans and cattle and wheat. What are you seeing? What are the trends you're seeing now? Are things slowing down, or are exports continuing to grow?
Well, it varies in different ways, in different products, but by and large, we take Asia, for example. It is key, just given the population, that we're able to sell our products into such large populations. We want to avoid disruptions there. The science-based standards are what is key, especially when I'm perhaps a little parochial here, but when you look at the quality of our products and the quantity in which we can produce them, it only makes sense to be able to sell more of our products into other countries, especially when they need them. Of course, to feed their population, but when they can leverage perhaps more economic opportunity there by buying our products, that's a win-win scenario.
Good. All right, well, I don't want to keep you past the appointed hour, and we need to get back to work because you're doing the Lord's work, and we appreciate everything you're doing so far. So
Thank
it's
you
been
so much.
enjoyable,
I appreciate
and
this
thanks for making
opportunity, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. I was going to go through a little bit of our paper here, some of the thinking, and just summarize it a bit, and then we're going to go to our distinguished panel to talk a bit more about the agriculture issue, which is going to be particularly difficult. So our paper is entitled "The U.S. UK Trade Agreement. Now is the Time," and as Chairman Smith said, you know, he tends to agree, and we appreciate that. Due to the unique compatibility of the two countries and the economic and strategic benefits offered by a U.S. UK trade agreement, we are urging USTR to wrap up negotiations soon. Concluding this agreement is unfinished business from the last administration, and success with the UK will build momentum for accomplishing the long list of new Biden administration trade initiatives, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the EU Trade and Technology Council, the America's Partnerships for Economic Prosperity, the U.S.-Kenya Partnership, and the U.S.-Taiwan Initiative. All of those agreements, I think, those aspirations will benefit from getting the U.S.-UK trade agreement locked in. In a dangerous world, they are more elusive and challenging than really tying down this familiar partnership between the U.S. and the U.K. The U.K. is actively negotiating membership in CPTPP in Asia right now. To my mind, sequencing is important. The U.S. will be in a stronger position in Asia if we try to wrap up U.S.-UK negotiations before or at the same time the U.K. joins CPTPP. And when the UK does enter, it will be able to hold out for restoring more of the disciplines that CPTPP countries dropped when the US backed out. I think there's, for example, 14 or so intellectual property provisions that are no longer there that would be beneficial to get back in. Reinvigorating its close relationship with the UK should improve the United States' ability to work bilaterally to develop constructive responses to strategic challenges posed by China. Closer collaboration with the UK will improve the United States' vantage point and influence in combating the China challenge. Overall, we see three key goals: locking in the USMCA template, which is road-tested and passed on a bipartisan basis. Two would be converging on some areas of regulation and where the promoting new mechanisms to harmonize and improve selected regulatory procedures, where the UK currently adheres largely to EU regulatory practices. The US and the UK are like-minded partners with similar commercial and strategic interests in the global economy. The backdrop for US-UK negotiations is the failure of the TTIP, the Trans-Pacific Trade and Investment Partnership, which floundered in large measure because of the European fears that a trade agreement would require acceptance of lower US health, safety, and environmental standards. This is an entrenched, decades-old debate. The deep-seated difference in view continues to undermine prospects for the US-EU TTC discussions that were launched in September 21 to support transatlantic convergence. Post-Brexit, the United Kingdom, which has been described as existing on the liberal end of the spectrum of EU member states, we think will be willing to take a fresh look at certain legacy EU regulatory barriers to US exports. Grassroots frustration in the UK with heavy-handed regulation is, at least rhetorically, behind Brexit and figures prominently in British politics today. This campaign theme was featured in the turbulent 2022 Conservative Party elections for prime ministers. And during a campaign video, Prime Minister Sunak promised to review and repeal all post-Brexit EU laws. Legislation governing EU retained law is currently before the British Parliament. Targeted regulatory reform is front and center there, and this, we think, presents a moment of opportunity for the United States. However, pursuing a comprehensive trade agreement with the U.S. presents a fundamental challenge for the U.K. How to square the circle of maintaining a system of regulations that is compatible with both the United States and the European Union, given that the EU remains the UK's #1 trading partner. Overall, it will be difficult to expect the UK to develop standards and regulatory policies that are separate for Europe and the United States. But working out how this clash can be reconciled will be sector-specific, highly technical, and probably one of the most difficult aspects of the US-UK negotiations. Our paper highlights sectoral opportunities for the United States. We'll discuss agriculture here on a later panel, and we looked at the chemical sector, medical products, financial services, digital trade, digital taxes, platform regulation, data flows, and privacy, and then said some things about energy security and green trade considerations. The US and the UK are both strong proponents of market principles in the WTO rules-based system and recognize that they face a common economic threat to their future in damaging Chinese non-market economy practices, which have led to overcapacity in many sensitive sectors. This is an area where exchange between the two governments holds unique promise for constructing an effective trade remedy response that could be broadened later to include more countries in a common approach to trade defense from non-market economies. While this is new ground and a very challenging assignment, we think the US and the UK should take it on. So in conclusion, the overall benefit of a US-EU trade agreement that we see is simple and obvious: improving the security and economic prospects of US-UK citizens and workers in the global economy. Congress, if it agrees, should hold the Biden administration to account for reaching this objective. Together, the US and the UK can achieve the following: maximize the benefit to the US economy of all the hard work that Congress and USTR put into the USMCA by replicating this very sound model with another major trading partner. Improve the overall bilateral regulatory environment across a range of sectors, which will reduce costs and create more secure supply chains. Establish binding principles for free data flows with trust that can be promoted globally. cement the U.S.-UK relationship with a meeting of minds on a fair and transparent trade remedy mechanism for protecting both countries' industries from non-market economy practices in a way that may dissuade China from so much injurious behavior in the future. The United Kingdom will be a valuable partner for the United States on a common and positive free market agenda for the global economy, while simultaneously mitigating the effects of rising bilateral tensions with China. The unusual bipartisan support for concluding a deal yet to be untapped by the Biden administration could make it a winning accomplishment for the President and this Congress. If the United States aspires to set standards for regulation impacting trade that will be followed by other countries, a U.S.-UK trade agreement is the first and most logical step. Missing the opportunity to strike a deal, particularly on data flows with trust and regulatory principles and agriculture, with such a well-matched partner as the United Kingdom, we think is difficult to justify. So we will now turn to a very distinguished panel we've got here to discuss some of the political dynamics and also the agriculture section in particular. And I've got a few questions for them, and then I'll turn to audience questions.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. I think I'm going first. So it's good to be here, and thanks to CSIS for having me. As Bill mentioned, I am a commissioner on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, but I want to make it very clear that my comments on agriculture today are my own personal views and do not reflect the thoughts of the Commission or any commissioner. Having said that, I'll make my quick chicken joke, since no one else has.
We're waiting for it.
Peracetic acid, which is what is used as a pathogen reduction treatment, you see this, not a very good joke.
You might give people some background.
Yeah, so it'll be obvious when I finish. Peracetic acid, which is used by the US industry for pathogen reduction treatments, ensuring the chicken is without disease, clears the standards of the European Food Safety Agency. In terms of stocking densities, in fact, many areas the US looks better, by which I mean better, more friendly towards animal welfare considerations, even than the UK. So there is a lot of noise and fury around chickens, but much of it is just that, is noise and fury. End of very bad joke about chickens. So I just want to pick up a few comments on a few of your things that appeared in the paper and what you talked about today very quickly. So I think sort of the first thing I'd say is that I don't think this has been fully realised around the world, actually, which is obviously the UK leaving the EU is a major global event. And it's an event that countries around the world, trading partners of the UK, need to do something with. If you don't do anything with it, it won't be a particularly important event. And the US industry can use it or they can not use it. And this is a dynamic environment. If US industry doesn't use it, then it's unlikely that the UK will diverge significantly from the European regulatory system. On the other hand, if US industry does push for changes, I think changes are likely to come. And the context for all of this is that there are various battles going on, or various competitions, to use less martial language, various competitions in the world. There's a competition about the world's operating system at a very high level. So, is it China's vision of a state-led capitalist system? Is it a more competition-based capitalist system? But below this, and maybe driving this to some extent, is a regulatory competition. And it isn't a regulatory competition between different countries and different states. It's a competition between two different approaches, and one approach is based on regulatory harmonization. If you want access to my market, you must have the same regulation, and we see that in the EU with data protection rules, and we see it in some of the SPS areas. Or it is, we're going to interoperate on the basis of regulatory recognition, adequacy, and equivalence. And I think where systems that are based on recognition, adequacy, and equivalence can interoperate, absolutely, based on your objective, your objectively achieved regulatory approaches, outcomes, essentially. It is almost impossible to see how a harmonization system can interoperate at all. It's basically California effect, Brussels effect. That's what's going to apply. And that is, I think, the big battle here, and that's the role, I think, a UK-US agreement can play in moving more countries, including the EU, to a more regulatory recognition type environment, which is basically the WTO system, if you look at the SPS and the TBT agreements. Why does that matter? Why does that battle matter? Because as the Congressman very eloquently said about competition, regulatory competition is more likely to yield a consumer welfare enhancing economic outcome. It's possible that harmonization will yield a consumer welfare enhancing outcome, but it's unlikely. So, and we certainly don't have any tension that causes that outcome. So I think that's why it matters. If you look at the EU and the divergence potential of the UK from the EU, it's principally in the following areas. So it's in SPS, clearly, where I would think that US industry would like to see the UK comply with WTO rules on SPS. I would think the US would want to see the UK move, as the UK indeed has said, that it will move more towards a risk-based system as opposed to a hazard-based system, move away from the sort of precautionary principle as it is applied by the EU. And on TBT and regulations affecting goods, I would think the US would want to see a divergence from the European regulatory new approach, which is relatively new, as its name suggests, the new approach, which includes essential requirements, which is getting much closer to telling you how to produce your product. It must have the following prescriptive essential requirements. So, and these kinds of issues between the US and the EU very much did determine the TTIP negotiation, the lack of success there, and certainly these difficulties between the EU and the US are long-standing issues that, if anything, have gotten worse, not better. I'd also say this is a dynamic environment. I mentioned we'd like as many countries as possible to adopt a sort of regulatory recognition type framework, which is more consistent with agreements like the CPTPP, USMCA that you mentioned. And I'd include Europe in that. It's not true to say, well, in those areas I discussed, Europe is clearly moving towards a more prescriptive system. It is not true to say that they do not do mutual recognition. They do mutual recognition. In agriculture, you can look at the EU-New Zealand veterinary agreement, which does not require identical regulation. They do say they wouldn't do an agreement like that again, but they have done it. So I do think it is possible. And then finally, to pick up the point that the Congressman talked about with respect to China and the bigger picture issues, market distortions in China and how we deal with those, I think, are one area where the US and the UK could absolutely collaborate on and work together on. We tend in the US, putting my US hat on for a moment, we tend in the US to oscillate from doing nothing about China to the kind of tariffs that we've recently seen, national security tariffs, 301 tariffs. I think there is I don't want to call it a middle ground, but there is a different approach, which would not dispense with tariffs. You could tarificate those distortions, but you would be much more focused on the scale and the metrics and the quantum of those distortions, which would enable you to signal to the Chinese essentially your imports based on economic competitiveness and normal market competition are welcome, but your imports based on distortion of your market for competitive and trade advantage, we have a robust mechanism to deal with those. And actually, if you look at the Trade and Agriculture Commission first report, they do suggest something along these lines, and you refer to it in your report. And I think the UK and the US also working together on alternatives to Belt and Road. The Congressman talked about China's role in Africa, Latin America, Asia. the global infrastructure initiative, which will be discussed in the G7. There are things that we can do to create alternative poles, if you will, to Belt and Road, where special zones that are governed by competition on the merits as an organising, principle, as opposed to being a playground for China's state-owned enterprises, that we can actually get in this game, which so far, we have not really, we meaning the West, essentially US, UK, Western interests, we have not really got into this game in Latin America, Asia, Africa, in some of these countries. So I think those are things that we can work together on. You've got the Atlantic Charter agreed in the G7 last year. You've got AUKUS. You've got other things, and AUKUS is far more than a submarine deal. You've got other things that are vehicles that can be used to promote these kinds of common approaches. And I think that's a huge opportunity there for US industry. So I would close there.
David.
Thanks, Meredith, for inviting me to participate in this panel today. When you called me, and I thought, well, I think I'll go to the files. So I went and dug out and I just remembered, didn't we start this before? Like in 2020, a memory stirred that we had begun this road. And that we had a whole set of negotiating objectives, and I went back and found the comments that our organization had filed, I'm sure many had, what we wanted out of a trade negotiation with the UK, and some of which has been covered. Standards, harmonization, moving UK as far as we can in a negotiation to come close to what we think are science-based standards for food. But the most important point I realized when I was looking at those old comments was we have a country with the UK that wants to do a trade agreement with the United States. And I can remember many a time over the years in past administrations going and saying, how about looking at doing an agreement with X country or with this? This will be good for agriculture. And there's always reasons to do it or not to do it. Political reasons, strategic, whatever. Other reasons. But here you have a country that wants to do it. I think that's something, as you so well pointed out in your paper, we need to take advantage of, right? This is a willing partner, and we have opportunity for growth here. For U.S. agriculture, we have in our policy book, which we don't often put individual countries, and our members have said, we want to do a trade deal with the United Kingdom. Now, we didn't used to have that policy up until about 3 or 4 years ago. We had a policy that said we wanted to do a trade deal with the European Union. Well, obviously, they realized we had to add a line of policy to encompass the UK, which reminds me, I was over in London this fall, and people would ask, visiting with various groups there and government agencies, and they'd say, you've been to London before? And I'd say, no, I have not. And they surprised, why not? I said, well, up until you did Brexit, I didn't really have to. But now we have to, right? We have to engage with Great Britain on its own terms, on its own trying to do new trade agreements, and trying to grow a market. That the US and the UK, we have some trade in food and agriculture. Roughly $2 billion a year we trade. Various different products. We sell them a lot of tree nuts. They're selling us, processed foods and such. One product we have in common that pretty much leads both sectors is our taste for each other's alcohol. There are certain people in America that like a certain whiskey product from Scotland, and there's certain people in Great Britain that like whiskey products from Kentucky or Tennessee. Wines from various states of ours. So there's a lot of trade in that, various beers. That's always a good trade. That can increase. But we also have limitations, as has been so well documented. Barriers that the UK has lived under for many decades. We hope will change through a negotiation. Barriers to our products that can be reduced and help our trade, especially in meats and other products. And there's also some tariffs to look at. We've seen over the last year the UK in their discussions with New Zealand and Australia is willing to deal on agricultural tariffs. So we hope those can be taken care of. The biotechnology approval process we know could be better, and there's always issues, not so much with Great Britain as some other European countries, but we always bring up the issues of geographic indicators for foods. Now, another issue area that we're very interested in our side in talking with Britain and British agriculture, and I think would come up and would influence the trade discussion, is our efforts on sustainability. We have, and we're moving forward, and I think we'll put this more concretely into U.S. law through a farm bill that we hope will get done this year, market-based, voluntary, incentive-driven programs. You know, through the Inflation Reduction Act last year, we have funds to work with. We're going to add to our programs. We're going to improve measures to deal and improve sustainability in U.S. agriculture in a variety of sectors, variety of ways. That's all going to be discussed through the various ag committees and by Congress this year. But it's an approach where we can help agriculture, help U.S. farmers. And I know Britain, of course, the European Union has their farm-to-fork approach. I know Britain is dealing with this. How do they handle it? Do you do a regulatory approach? Do you do incentive-based? And how is that also going to affect trade? How does it affect the stance? We don't want to see sustainability used for the purposes of protection. That is something we're very much against, and we're keeping a wary eye on that. And in fact, as we're here today, the Secretary for the British Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs is here in D.C. speaking to a group about sustainability efforts and the environment in the UK. So both sides, I think, are very interested in that. I think that'll be a part of any discussion between the U.S. and the U.K., and we look forward to that. So I hope we can engage. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Jeff, you've had more experience in international regulatory cooperation than a lot of folks at OIRA and everything. So what's your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. Happy to talk about that. And want to talk a bit about regulations, also supply chain, goods movement, maybe a little bit on sub-federal measures. Talking about regulatory cooperation, I have a little bit of PTSD from working on this at USTR and OIRA in the transatlantic context. You know, we did our best to stay away from chickens in the TAC and high-level regulatory cooperation forum, and you know, experienced the TTIP regulatory talks where you had an unstoppable force meet an immovable object. Because that's how we negotiate, that's how they negotiate, and there was ultimately no flexibility. But I think that's why, you know, a U.S. UK trade agreement is so tantalizing, because we think that we might actually be able to make progress in some of those areas. Now, obviously, the UK has to walk a fine line because, as folks have mentioned, that EU is their largest market. But a lot of that, how far they move, is going to depend on how much we're offering on the market access side and on some of these other areas. I know that there's a great deal of respect between U.S. regulators and UK regulators, and we could talk about that a little bit more. And, you know, from the OIRA perspective and the UK regulatory system, that helps a great deal. There's a lot of trust and confidence between the regulators. So I think, you know, starting on a horizontal level, we could negotiate, you know, the highest level agreement on good regulatory practices. And I think we could also do a lot together on conformity assessment. When businesses used to come in and talk to me at USTR, that's where the costs were, the duplicative conformity assessment, the extra, you know, the time lags, the extra costs, particularly for small companies. So if we could even work out common methods of determining what's the appropriate procedure, you're more likely then to come up with similar outcomes at the end. I'd like to see us commit to doing, and again, the private sector would have to be involved in this, more joint standards work, working together between BSI and different standards bodies in the US, and potentially a mutual recognition agreement on conformity assessment bodies. I don't think that MRAs are going to be a panacea. I also have PTSD from working on the US-EU 1998 MRA implementation. So basically you negotiate equivalence, and then as soon as one side changes, you're no longer in equivalence. So every time you have to make that determination that they're equivalent again, and normally you're going to want the other side to come up, and how long is it going to take Congress if the UK moves to amend the legislation to bring it up to that level? So you could have big gaps there. So A lot of it depends on the sector and the willingness to work together. And this is another issue where I think we need to make changes in how we think about trade agreements, because, you know, the glory at USTR is negotiating the agreement, but if it's really going to create market access, it's about the implementation. And so we really need to focus on that and build in, and a lot of that's going to be political will from administration to administration. Moving on to supply chain, I think one of the areas there where I think it'd be really important to start off, again, if we're thinking about the UK as a key friendshoring partner, is supply chain mapping. Transparency is often the first step in any good government policy, I find, and if you don't know that you have suppliers within the region, you're not going to use them. I was on a supply chain panel last year where I talked afterwards with someone on the panel who runs supply chain for a very large U.S. company, and I said, do you know who the potential suppliers are? And his answer was, we know what we know. And you know, he said that he goes to trade shows where he lives and routinely meets new suppliers that he hadn't heard of before. And so if they don't know, then how are most companies going to know? So if we actually commissioned that kind of mapping exercise so that you knew for a particular supply chain that you thought was critical, then you could actually work together. And then once you have that transparency, then you can step back and say, all right, let's say it's semiconductors or autos. What are we missing? Are we missing something that's strategic, whether it's a material or a component? Is there a third country we can work with? Rather than, we don't need to invent problems. If we already have a third country or other countries where it's diversified, let's work with them. We don't need to come up with a reshoring solution, but maybe we do. Once you have that baseline, then you could start working with those suppliers to make sure they're up to spec. So are they up to spec on cyber? Because as an OEM, you need all of your suppliers to be meeting the same standard, otherwise that's going to be the way in. Are you going to meet the carbon standards that we need with CBAM coming? Do you have the training programs in place to make sure that you know, we can make the high quality products that will distinguish our products in the marketplace? So I think that's a great place to start once we identify the critical supply chains. A third area I think where we can cooperate is goods movement. We've learned a lot over the last couple of years dealing with congestion issues, both in the US and in the UK dealing with Brexit, in terms of how to use digital tools to try to solve some of these issues. I mean, in the early days of the pandemic, they ran out of hand sanitizer at the Port of Los Angeles, and the longshore workforce wasn't even going to be able to go in until they figured that out. We've progressed a lot from those days, but there's so much more that we can do in terms of sharing and exchanging information within the supply chains to make them more efficient. And the US and the UK could definitely work together on that. Small plug, we just created a standards committee on digital supply chain at ASTM, where potentially those kinds of things could be developed, whether it's port-to-port collaboration or government-to-government collaboration or both. I definitely think that's an area where, just imagine if we created joint standards and there was potentially expedited customs clearance between the US and the UK based on those standards. And I'd much rather develop the standards outside than have the governments develop them, because then that takes care of your mutual recognition problem. If we're all working together on a standard, then we bring it to the governments and say, adopt this. And then the last thing is sub-federal measures. I think the UK has been very strategic in negotiating the MOUs with different states. And you know, I think some people will just say, well, they're non-binding. But sub-federal measures was always a no-go in most chapters for the US. If anyone came in to talk to me about that, I just, okay, we can't do that. There's no way we're going to get that through Congress. The states will hate it. But the easiest way to get an agreement through is if people on both sides came in and said, we both agree that this is good. And if they're setting the table and working to develop those relationships, commercial relationships, maybe there is something we can do with certain states on mutual recognition and on procurement and on promoting investment. So I think that's a great, and maybe it's a positive list approach. Maybe not all states are involved, but it's the UK. So if you're going to try really ambitious things, this is who you try it with. So those are some ideas I just wanted to throw out for discussion. So thanks for inviting me.
That's terrific. So I have a question for each of you. If you were Ambassador Tai and you had to pick two sectors, issues where there might be some opportunity in this negotiation, what would you tell your staff to go work on?
Well, I would say, and I just would echo a couple of things that were said there. I mean, I think in terms of supply chain management, this is where there's a huge opportunity. And actually, even in agriculture, you talked a lot about the autos and other sectors, but even agriculture, one of the things you could do is look at delivery of protein, basically, is what we're talking about around the world. And the UK and the US coming together to figure out where in the supply chain we can work together to do that. I mean, a great example of a country that got this supply chain issue absolutely right in dairy is New Zealand. I mean, it came out, New Zealand produces 2% of the world's milk, controls 30% of the world's dairy. By using supply chain tools to figure out the most lucrative bits of the supply chain, which is very complex in dairy. So I think agriculture is actually an area where we could work together on gene editing, where there's a bill in the UK Parliament now, synthetic biology, all of these things where the UK has a science leadership role. And then digital in general, digital and tech in general. Now, in order to do this, you need to have data flow with trust, which is what Minister Kono in Japan is talking about with respect to the G7, which I think is well stated. GDPR is not data flow with trust. So we need to move to something slightly different that actually prioritizes flow, but recognizes that this must be trusted flow. And I think if we can crack that problem, then I think we can make some progress on adequacy, and that underpins a lot of the digital stuff that we can do. But also on this point about expediting goods movements, digital trade corridors, single trade windows, these kinds of customs things that we can work on together. And some of that has been discussed in the MOUs that the UK has with different states. That could be a very powerful tool as well. So I think there's a range of different things. And look at the sectors where we're both very, very strong. Financial services, where there's probably no higher degree of trust in financial services regulation than between the UK and the US. So we need to be able to do something with that. So that would be one. Pharmaceuticals, where we're both very powerful pharmaceutical players. And in fact, this is something where the UK, in the context of the TRIPS waiver discussions in the WTO, the UK was the only country, really, that stood up for actually the US pharmaceutical sector in trying to ensure that we didn't march towards essentially an open door on eliminating crucial aspects of patent protection. So I think IP protection in pharmaceutical is another area where we absolutely should be able to work together.
David?
Well, I'll pick one that may sound like it's delving into the hardest, but I think on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, if you look at the point of view that so much is there to work with, we have a WTO SPS agreement that was just modernized last year at the ministerial. Well, everybody signed off on it. Whether they followed it or not, but they all signed off on it. We have the Codex. We have the organization, the OIE for World Animal Health regulations, the International Plant Protection Convention, US and UK, Europe, everybody's a signatory to these and participate in these bodies. So it's getting it through the difficulty, and we understand domestic politics, of course. We can remember going back, Bill will love this, I remember so well the chicken balloons, whether they were in Brussels or in London. People like having balloons with chickens to protest that thing or another. I think somewhere in England or London there is a novelty balloon company. They seem to have a balloon for every occasion.
There have been a lot of balloons.
They have a lot of balloons. So, but this stuff is done. It's signed off on. People say they want to support this. I think that wealth of work can be put into this negotiation. And yield some good results.
Great, thanks. Jeff?
Two ideas from TTIP days. One I think will be interesting is autos. And I'm going to go back on what I said before about mutual recognition. That might be an area where we might be able to make progress with the UK. The issue there was we wanted to compare the automotive safety data between the EU member states and the US, and we couldn't get the data from all the member states to be able to make that determination. I remember one of the EU negotiators said, well, you can trust us that it's equivalent. That's not gonna work when you're asked to show your work to Congress, but the UK had that data. And so if we have that data, then potentially that might be a place where we could strike that kind of agreement. Now I think that the caveats are there's going to have to be some interest in the regulators in doing it from a non-cost perspective. So just lowering costs for US industry is not enough to get a regulator interested. They're going to want to see some benefit in the reduction of accidents or pedestrian safety or whatever it is. So we'd have to figure out how to do that. That might involve potentially every time there's a standard where one is higher than the other, the lower one has to come up to the higher standard. And so they're higher cost, but then maybe they're lower cost overall because you don't have to make two vehicles. So that potentially could happen. The other area that we could look at is FDA-regulated products. To the pharmaceuticals point, we have a MRA on pharmaceutical GMP inspections. And again, UK was part of the first tranche because of the respect between the regulators. So I feel like we could look at that and see are there other products we could expand that to. FDA is very flexible on the medical device side in terms of accepting different standards to demonstrate conformity. So potentially ISO standards, BSI standards. That's another potential area. We could also work with the UK in different international regulator forums like the IMDRF to try to align how we do approval processes and other documentation requirements. So I think there are a couple areas where we could explore.
Okay, well, I'm going to take a question from, I think, our online audience just to show Jeff that I can manage this equipment here. And this is actually a theme I hear a lot. And this is from Alan Taylor saying, I can imagine that sectors such as agriculture may be difficult. Should we go for a series of trade agreements starting with the easier sectors to get some benefits for both countries as soon as possible? What's the best strategy?
Best strategy is not leaving out agriculture. That's for sure. I'll say that. Not just from a sectoral point of view, congressional point of view. This is a major part of what countries deal with. They have their own agriculture. UK is a major food importer. Sure, most of it comes from the EU, but they import from around the world and import from us. I think it's a basic part of our economies and certainly has to be talked about.
And the UK is also a major exporter, as you mentioned, of Scotch whisky and other agricultural products. So, I mean, I think we have to think about which bits of US industry are going to be crucial to getting any trade deal over the line. And obviously agriculture is one of them, a major one. And I think, you know, what would be good is a sort of consistency between the industries that will get it over the line, agriculture, tech, etc., pharmaceutical to some extent, and where there are real potential opportunities to work together. I do think there is one other aspect of perhaps the question, which is, you know, you negotiate an FTA, but that does not preclude you. And I think in the TTIP context, Angela Merkel talked about lighthouse projects. There are certain things you can do along the way to generate momentum. And I think, you know, some of these things we talked about, digital trade corridors, this kind of thing, you can do that to generate momentum. And we have time, I think, to do some of those things in order to generate momentum for a wider FTA.
Jeff?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think if you're going to go for quick wins, they need to be high impact and help you get the agreement over the line. So totally agree.
Yeah, to answer Alan's question, I actually think you need a comprehensive agreement. We've tried a lot of negotiations with the EU, and I ran the industry office at USTR, and lots of industries are ready to do an agreement get rid of the tariffs with the EU, but it was the agriculture sector that politically would not make it work for the U.S. if it wasn't a comprehensive agreement that was being implemented. So it's an interesting debate. All right, I think I'm getting up to the time here. I just wanted to quote Chairman, oh, excuse me. Okay, all right. Hey, how are you?
Hi, good.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, Merrily International Trade Today. Sure. We talked a lot about our offensive interests with agriculture, but I wondered if anyone wanted to address, is there any defensive interest in the U.S. that is making it harder for USTR to pick this back up? Is it textiles? Is it aerospace? What's the sensitivity on our side to UK imports?
Jeff, you might talk about interagency. If it came up as a question, what would be some of the concerns about this agreement? What do you think is holding USTR back?
Well, I mean, I think at a higher level, I mean, a political decision has been made that the administration isn't doing FTAs, at least right now, irrespective of what the defensive concerns are. In terms of the interagency process, I think this would be one of the, assuming that a decision was made, this would be one of the easiest interagency processes ever in terms of agreeing to do an FTA with the UK. I'm not worried about that.
Yeah.
I think if I had to nitpick, again, going back to my PTSD, I think the concern that some folks that have been around for a while would be, you know, the EU got us to negotiate TTIP and said we're going to move on some of these things, and then we got in the room and there was no movement. And so they're going to worry, is the same thing going to happen? But I think we're not going to know until we do it. And a lot of it is, how much are we going to move? Are we going to put market access on the table? Are we going to do some of these, you know, supply chain friendshoring and goods movement initiatives to really make it worth the UK's while to move in our direction? And so if we do that, then I think that takes care of a lot of those concerns.
Yeah.
I think there's three things, basically. Two general ones, one very specific one. Generally, the two major ones, obviously, are labour and environment. And as you said earlier on, this is one of the few countries where there is no race to the bottom on labour and environment. US negotiating objectives, you know, you cannot lower your labour and environmental standards for trade benefit. Well, the UK's are higher, depending on how you look at these things, but more restrictive, shall we say. And therefore, I think that is not going to be a problem. I think with regard to the regulatory issues and the standards issues, which are going to become, you know, will become difficult. The issue of standard-setting organizations, what is a real international standard-setting organization? The role of, you know, ISO, IEC, the role of Senelec and ETSI in the European system. What is the UK's role there? And I think there's two ways to crack that problem. One is, do you say, well, we trade a lot with the European Union, therefore we're going to remain in Senelec, ETSI, we're going to remain in these bodies? Or do you say, as a global company, what do I want the world to look like? Do I want standard setting based on genuinely international standard setting organizations? If that's the world I want to, if that's the regulatory world I want to see, how does the UK and the US achieve that goal? But that's going to be difficult, there's no doubt about it.
Okay, there was one more question out there.
Very much for a very interesting discussion. I'm Brian Cahalan from the Embassy of Ireland. Just to note from the Irish government's perspective, the importance of the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland being addressed in the context of a US UK trade agreement, and to welcome in that context the positive evolution of discussions between the EU and the UK on implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So just to mention that, especially in the context of this 25th anniversary year of the Good Friday Agreement. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, just on that, and full disclosure, I help run the Trader Support Service for the Northern Ireland Protocol goods moving from GB into Northern Ireland, and I think you're right. I think there's a lot more movement towards a negotiated solution of that. And I think protection of both strands of the Good Friday Agreement, North-South and East-West. You were talking about the third strand, internal, yeah, absolutely. But the pressure has been obviously on the East-West strand. And I think anything we can do to simplify, ease the East-West strand, while at the same time, this is the challenge, maintaining what we have succeeded on with the North-South strand, will be key to any negotiated solution. I think we are moving in the right direction there.
All right, one more question. Can I do it? Or are we, you're going to put the hook on me?
Just real quick, I think part of the political
You need to do the mic.
I think part of the window of opportunity we have for a trade agreement with the UK is also dictated by the election schedule in the UK. There's expected to be a general election, and it looks like I think a lot of people expect Labour to make a big gain. How does that affect the possibility of closing how a UK-US trade agreement would work? And also the UK has been knocking on the door of governors and states looking for MOUs. Does that help the process also?
Yeah, I mean, we were mentioning the MOU process with states, which is very innovative and I think a good outreach on behalf of the UK government. And your other, what was the other question?
Labour, potentially.
Oh, Labour. Yeah. I mean, I think we ought to do it now, but I think a Labour government would want to do it too, is my intention. So, I mean, I think we just have bipartisan agreement in both countries to do it. It may look a little bit different, and I couldn't predict the different contours, but I think it's a positive sign that they would be positive about it.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be that much difference, actually, between a future Labour government and the current government on things like labour and the environment. I mean, it's hard to see how the UK could get even more restrictive on those issues. I mean, if you read the labour and environment chapters of the UK-Australia and the UK-New Zealand trade deals, there's no, I mean, it's hard to imagine how a Labour government would want more in there, or could even have more in there. And also, I think you know, there was an interesting exchange recently, just to your point, between the then Trade Policy Minister, we seem to change our ministers quite frequently, Greg Hands, who was advocating on the UK-India negotiations and was criticised by his opposite number for the slowness of the pace of these negotiations. This is a negotiation with India, which we're supposed to conclude by the summer. And there was criticism about the pace of the negotiation. So, you know, my reaction to the minister would be, well, you should thank your lucky stars that the Labour Party is saying to you, you're not going fast enough. You know, so I don't think that will really change. You know.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up now, and appreciate you all listening, because I think it's evidence this is a very industry-specific, regulatory-specific exercise that's going to happen between two sophisticated countries that are highly technologically advanced, and it's going to take a lot of work, and I think people that are interested ought to work on it. And I'm going to close the day with Chairman Smith's comment that he couldn't agree more with the idea that it's time to look at a U.S. UK FTA.